Jackanory, Jackanory. Jackanory.
I'm going to tell you the story of an amazing person called Corrie Ten Boom. We'll start the story today as she's a little 4-year-old girl sharing a bed with her 6-year-old sister Nolly, scared, thinking that there's an animal in the corner of the window. Of course, it's not really there, but she's scared. "Can I hold on to your nightie, Nolly? Then I won't be afraid," said Corrie. But when Nolly wanted to turn over, she couldn't, because Corrie's little hand had a tight grip on her nightie. It's hard to sleep when that happens. So the next night, Nolly told her little sister, "It's not easy when you hold on to my nightie, Corrie. You better hold on to your doll's nightie." And Nolly was right. It worked. The next morning, when Corrie woke up, the house was already full of life. Betsy, Corrie's other sister, helped her to get dressed. Mother was singing downstairs, and Willem, her older brother, was asking for clean sacks. The 3 aunts, who lived in the same house, could be heard chattering with each other. At breakfast, Mother poured the tea, while Aunt Anna sliced the bread. Father had already looked up the psalm in the Bible that he wanted to read to the family later. Aunt Anna would tell her lovely stories about the good old days. And Mother would tell her wonderful Bible stories. Her favourite was about the shepherd who had 100 sheep and took very good care of them. They felt very safe with the shepherd. They were never afraid because they knew that he was protecting them. But one day, one of the sheep wandered away. How frightened that little sheep was, all alone in the dark. Do you know what the shepherd did when he lost the sheep? He went looking for it, and he didn't stop until he had found it. How happy he was as he carried it home on his shoulders. The Lord Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." He wants to take care of you, just like the shepherd took care of the sheep. He said, "The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep." He died on the cross and rose again for you, and because of that, God can forgive all of your sin. Corrie loved that story and asked her mother to tell it again and again. It was when she was 5 years old that Corrie asked the Lord Jesus to forgive her sins and come into her life. She knew that Jesus was her friend and that he would always be with her, even in the dark. She was no longer afraid in bed at night. She no longer had to hold on to Nolly's nightie or to the doll's nightie either. Instead, she began to talk to Jesus when it was dark and she was scared. You can't see him, but he can see you, and he hears everything you tell him, no matter how softly you speak. Quite close to their house was the Smederstraat, the blacksmith street. And in that street there were lots of quite scary people. Many of them were drunk and would fight, and she hated the fighting. Every time she saw them fighting, she would run home crying. The police would come and take people away to the police station. She wondered what she could do for these men. So at night she would pray for them. "Lord, will you please save all the people in Smederstraat?" She'd pray that prayer every night. Many years later, when she grew up, she went camping with a group of girls. One night she'd been telling them about Jesus, and one of the girls said to her, "Don't you know that I'm your neighbour? I live 1 street from your home, in Smederstraat." "So do I," said another girl. "My mother used to live there," said another. And then she realised that God had answered her prayer. "Lord, will you save the people in Smederstraat?" And he'd given her the opportunity to share the gospel with them. One day, with her mother and Nolly, Corrie went home to visit some very poor people. They lived at the top of an old house where they only had 1 room. In that room they had to sleep, eat, cook, do the laundry, everything. But that's not what made Corrie feel sad. She found out that someone had died in that house, and it made her afraid. She began to understand what death means, and that also one day everybody would die. Father, Mother, Betsy, Willem, Nolly, the aunts. Just imagine if they'd all die and she'd be left behind, all alone. At the mealtime that evening, her father reached for his Bible and began to read from Psalm 46. In verse 2 it says, "Therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." At that moment, Corrie realised that whatever happens, God is always with his children. She started to pray. "Jesus, I know that you will always be there, but please let my relatives stay with me for a long time yet. They'll be in heaven long enough. I cannot do without them." When she was in bed that night, her father came to tuck her in, as he did every night. She began to tell him about her fears. "Daddy, I'm so afraid that you'll all die and I'll be left behind all by myself." Father stroked her face and said, "Corrie, when you take the train somewhere, when do I give you the money for the ticket? Is it 2 weeks in advance?" "No, of course not," she said. "Just before I leave." And our Father in heaven does exactly the same with us. If Mother or I or the aunts have to die, only then will God give you the strength to bear that sorrow. But since it's not happened yet, you don't need to be afraid now. Corrie was reassured. Never, even when she was grown up, did she forget what her father had told her then. Perhaps you're afraid about something terrible happening to you. Even though you believe in Jesus, you might be afraid that someone you love will die, that your home will be burgled, or that someone will hurt you on the way to school. Don't be ashamed of being afraid. Tell Jesus and he will help you. He'll give you the strength to face even the greatest difficulties you could imagine. But as long as this terrible thing has not yet happened, you need not be afraid of it. One day, when Corrie was 6, she held onto the banister with both hands, crying, "I don't want to go to school. I don't want to go to school. I want to stay at home." "But Corrie," said her father, "at school you learn how to read." "But I can read already," she said. "And you can learn maths." "Daddy, you can teach me maths," she said. "But don't you want to play with the other children?" "No, I don't want to. I want to help my Aunt Anna." "What's the matter?" asked Daddy. "But all 6-year-olds go to school. You need to learn." "But I'm afraid to go to school," she said. "Oh, is that it?" said her father. "If you're afraid of going to school, let's go to school together." So her father put on his hat and coat and reached down to take Corrie's hand. But she held on tightly to the banister with all 10 fingers. However, her father's fingers were stronger, and he loosened each one of those 10 fingers from the banister. Then he grasped her hand firmly in his and took her off to school. I don't want to go to school," she kept saying, but her father was strong and determined and brought her all the way to the classroom. "I'll be waiting for you at the end of the day," he said. And that's how it went on for 3 days. But on the 3rd day, Corrie saw another father coming along with a crying boy in his arms. "Oh, how pathetic," Corrie thought. Then she realised, I'm acting just like that myself. Startled, she stopped crying. Daddy no longer needed to drag her to school. She went to school with Nolly, and she discovered that school isn't that bad after all. It's quite nice when you're able to do a difficult psalm all by yourself, or when you know the answer to a difficult question and the teacher says to you, "Well done." Corrie's cousin Dot was the same age as herself, and they'd played together in the big church. Dot's father was the caretaker of the church, and he didn't mind if they played there. But one afternoon it started to get dark. "Corrie, let's go home, I'm scared," said Dot. Scared? Corrie didn't understand. How could you be scared if the Lord Jesus is right here with you and me? Well, that's where our story ends today. But next time we'll hear some really quite scary things that happened to Corrie and her family, and that Jesus was with her through all of those things.
Jackanory.